Hello, my name is Clara Maveglia and I set up the Cultural Entrepreneurship Institute here in Berlin. Today my guest is Volker Gerhardt. We are at the Humboldt University and I am really looking forward to talk with him about his work. Welcome, Herr Professor Gerhardt. Herr Professor Gerhardt, schön, dass Sie da sind.
Professor Gerhardt, wonderful to see you, and it's kind of you to take the time to talk to us. Would you like to introduce yourself? I'm happy to do so. You've already mentioned my name. I'm still teaching at the Department of Philosophy, which in 1992 I was able to redevelop here at the Humboldt University. I had been teaching in Halle and in Cologne, and for a long time I was a student official, as we used to call them. So I'm a member of the 1968 generation in Germany, although I never attached particular importance in later years to that label, because although I was aware that 68 brought an awful lot of momentum to developments in what used to be West Germany in the late 60s and early 70s, but I know that we got a lot of things wrong in our analysis. So during my period as a research fellow, as an assistant professor, I took a great interest in issues of educational policy, and I was fortunate enough to be allowed to help develop the idea for the distance university, the Open University in Hagen. And I think I can say that this was the most successful new university to be founded in Germany. But the temptations to go into politics, I was well able to resist. I didn't enter into a political career. I quite deliberately, even though I was very interested in all these political matters, remained in philosophy. And I think that was the most important decision I made in my life, that I would give scholarship, research, the priority, and despite all my commitment to social and political questions, I was always able to retreat into my own special field. And that, I think, gave me the energy, the resources to devote myself to those big philosophical questions and contribute, I think, to some of them. Thank you very much. I wanted to add something because you have such a strong position. You have achieved so much and are still achieving a great deal, so I'd like to add some details. You're not only a very popular professor, and following unification, as you said, the first director of the Department of Philosophy here at the Humboldt University. You are even honorary professor at the University of Wuhan in China. You were coordinating all research projects undertaken by German academies. You've been a member of the German Ethics Council, and together with Detlef Ganten and Julian Nieder-Romelin, you were in charge of the Humanity Project, the follow-up to the Human Genome Project, which asked about human self-conception, and also a program funded by the federal government for questions of human consciousness. You're also on the Council of the Protestant churches that looks into higher education policy, and your books are very popular. So what makes you so successful? Where do you get all that energy from? First of all, let me explain something. The scientific academies in Germany, there are 8 of them, have their own research projects, and they are funded jointly by the federal government and the regional state governments. There is an academic commission which takes these, I think, 200 research projects, which include publication of historical musical scores and other historical research. And no doubt this is the biggest venture in Germany responsible for research into the humanities. And I helped to coordinate that because I chaired the committee that coordinates it for 11 years. So I simply presided over a commission that was responsible for many things, but the academies themselves are in charge of their projects. Now, if you're going to offer me a list like that, I can't remember all the things I've achieved over the years. I can only say that I've been very fortunate, as I have already said, in that, on the one hand, I'm able to pursue all my philosophical issues in great depth, but that doesn't fulfill me entirely, because I can see that the metaphysical issues that surround philosophical and political questions depend on social frameworks and on the people involved in them. So from that point of view, I think that if you are interested in social issues, you can't completely retreat into your own special field. And that's why I've always been committed to issues that influence the framework for research. And that's why the best way I was able to recuperate from my scientific work was to do something different. I didn't have to have a nap or sit in my garden swing or take a holiday. Simply by alternating different tasks, I was able to regenerate my energy, which doesn't mean that I didn't sometimes do some pretty hard holiday making or a lot of sport, because without that I wouldn't have had the physical constitution to absorb all this. But it's no secret. We human beings are very diverse. We can do many things in our lives, and the division of labour is not just a matter of organising civilized societies. I think we also have to approach our own lives like that, make our lives easier with a division of labour, which helps us to replicate our energy. And perhaps that's one reason why I've been able to do rather more than just my lectures and seminars and books. But what made you the person you are? And I'm talking about your professional career too. If I only knew what had made me what I am, it's very difficult to say. I can only say good fortune to have had such a loving mother who had so much wisdom under the harshest conditions you can imagine, because I was born in 1944. And on the day I was born, there was an assassination attempt on Hitler's life, and one of the suspects was my mother's employer. And the fact that I was born on that date, the 21st of July, relates to the shock that my mother experienced, because the prince, whose household she basically ran, had been led off by the Gestapo the previous day. So, very harsh conditions. 6 months after I was born, my mother was on the run, at the time when my father had already fallen at the front in Russia. For a year and a half she was on the run, and when I was 2 years old, she finally arrived at the house that belonged to the parents of her husband. And in great poverty, under very difficult conditions, I lived there from 1946 onwards, and I can only say, looking back, I had the happiest childhood I can imagine. And to experience under such conditions that is possible is, I think, a lucky star, certainly in my passage. And if I should single out anybody, it would be my mother, who promoted my well-being. So you have a vision in your life, a philosophy of life. What would that be? Perhaps we can start with that. Yes, you could call it a vision, although of course, as a young boy, as a pupil in school, as a teenager, you wouldn't call it that. But one of my major experiences is that when you're in a difficult situation, you can haul yourself out by your own effort. And that was the experience that I had at the end of the war. Everything had been destroyed, the houses were in ruins, and we played in the ruins, and it was clear to us that is our new life. I arrived in Hagen, in Dortmund. These were towns where new life was beginning to stir. And of course people had memories of the old times, but they were focusing on the new. I can't revive all that in such a short interview, but I can say one thing. It was absolutely decisive for me that I was able to play a part in the unification of the two Germanys. I was very happy with my professorship in Cologne. I had been invited to a professorship in Munich at the university, and I didn't even consider it. But in 1992, when I was invited to come to Halle, and I visited Halle and saw that the same major tasks needed to be tackled as I had experienced in those bombed cities of Hagen, Dortmund, and the rest of the Ruhr district in my childhood, I suddenly had this sense of youthfulness and great expectation and potential, and the question never arose for me. Cologne is saturated, it's very interesting, but I knew I needed to leave it and go to this town, Halle, and set up a new centre for research into the Enlightenment. I wanted to do that amid the conditions created by what had been the Soviet zone. In the end, I didn't remain very long in Halle because I was very attracted to the Humboldt University here in Berlin, where there were far greater tasks to tackle, where the damage that had been done by Marxist ideology was far more evident. That was a real challenge to me. I didn't come as an occupier. I didn't feel like somebody whose job it was to close the old structures down, but working together with people who had been through those times and had done some very interesting research at the Humboldt, to work with them on this new reconstruction effort. And the fact that it worked out so well is one of the satisfactory results of my career here at the Humboldt. Why philosophy, I have to ask? Why is philosophy so important to you, or in general as a discipline? When I began to study, I didn't know that yet. I could have studied physics. Then I opted for psychology and sociology in conjunction with philosophy because the family, essentially my mother, of course, although she didn't try to influence me, it was above all the uncles and aunts around us who functioned as advisors and thought the lad should learn something sensible so that he would not go hungry as a philosopher. It wasn't immediately possible, but eventually I realized that my interest in philosophy was so great that I could make a career of it. Things could have turned out differently. You can never plan. I had a lot of good fortune. I had very good teachers who helped me and above all set me a good example. In fact, even in school, I had a teacher who stimulated me, and that was a man who, because of the war, had remained in the school as an archaeologist and offered me a lot of stimulation in philosophy and other fields. And under those conditions, I was able to write my first essay in philosophy that attracted some attention. So then it was clear. There were a lot of temptations. People tried to suggest I should enter parliament or become a civil servant in a ministry and design education policy. It was all very interesting and I didn't hold it in contempt. But I preferred to opt for the more insecure position of an assistant researcher. Why? What is it that you like about philosophy? Well, if you ask me what I like, obviously it is a pleasant way of working because you are in charge of your own working life. Of course, you have a lot of responsibilities and you depend on many factors, in particular the students to whom you wish to offer a solid training. So there are a lot of ties, and especially in recent years, examinations have become particularly strenuous. But in spite of all that, if you look at all the important dimensions to your career, it's your own contemplation that enables you to set the course for yourself. Of course, you need to substantiate what you do in the context of the way other people see things, and you can hope to use your powers of persuasion to convince them that it's right. That is why one attracts attention, and hence the success, as you like to call it. If you're a professor in a university like a Humboldt, which has such a powerful reputation, how do you absorb that pressure? I wouldn't formulate it that way. The universities are still organized in such a way that individuals can develop. Of course, there is an expectation that you will take on certain functional responsibilities as a rector of a faculty or working on the academic council or on the academic senate or some other committee. But if your aspiration is to concentrate on a huge issue which is going to require all your energy, then you would have to be in everybody's bad books if you were not going to be able to do that when you wanted to. So I think you can unfold your individuality, especially in a very big university where there are so many university teachers, because we have this division of labour and they are all aspiring to assert their interests. You don't have to be on the academic council or senate or work as a peer reviewer for the research society. All of this absorbs a lot of time, and I think if you have the predisposition, and a university teacher should have a predisposition to follow scholarly initiative, then for all the importance of teaching, one should have enough time for research. Of course, if I were an education reformer, I would be looking at that proportion of the time university staff spend on their research, and I would be wanting to increase that proportion. Not that I want to suggest, at least in my career, that I haven't had that opportunity. Now a very different question for you. What does ethics mean? Etymologically, if we go back to ancient Greek, ethos or ethos, depending which version we're going for, is on the one hand teachings about what is proper, what is human behavior, and in the older meaning, it also refers to one's origins, the place one comes from, one's home. And I think that both of these connotations are included in the term ethics. They were merged in the 4th century BC. Basically, these are teachings about how human beings, as conscious beings, among other animals or among other beings that should be respected, how these humans behave. And so I think ethics is, if you like, the fundamental discipline behind what we call philosophy. What it amounts to is that a person who thinks, who has insights or recognitions and take actions, and that is a responsibility we have and which no one can deny us, how we organize our lives. This leads me to a very topical question. We are experiencing many wars at the moment, many at the same time. It's very sad. And we can read this every day in the newspapers, what has been happening there. So I wanted to ask you, you know a great deal about the will to power. Can you talk to us about that? All these wars have something to do with power and the will to power. How do you see it? Oh, I need to go back a little in order to answer your question in terms which I would find appropriate. Yes, I addressed power back in the early 80s in order to understand this phenomenon and demarcate it, and to show that it is an authentically human characteristic which is expressed in power, and the need for social conduct, and to show that we cannot refrain from having power or from striving for power, because all action is based on the power to do something, power in the sense of being able. If we want to read a book, we need to have the power to hold it or to switch on the computer. It's an elementary ability in the way we deal with the world and with ourselves. Of course, that's a very elementary description, and if you're going to ask me what that's got to do with Syria or Iraq or Ukraine, well, first of all, we have to recognize this elementary ability or power. We need to learn how to deal with it. And above all, we need to recognize that having power doesn't necessarily mean that we have to assert that power through coercion, through force. Power requires will. I tried to explore that in my work. But to use power doesn't mean that we have to break the will of others. So if we use our power correctly, there needs to be a factor which is the recognition of other people's power. There's never simply one power. Even that concept of omnipotence, which we like to apply to the divine, is a contradiction in itself. Power can only exist in relation to other powers. And the great problem of human action, and above all human civilization, are these reciprocal aspirations to power, balancing those out so that they do not explode in violence. And that is, if you like, the prerogative of law. The invention of law means that we can recognize different aspirations to power and place that within a balanced relationship that both parties or all parties can understand. That is an expectation we have of civilization and indeed of our politicians, that they create those balanced, peaceful conditions. Now you might say, where do we have that these days? In the situations you've just mentioned, we don't have them. And in the first years of this century, we haven't had them. In fact, we've never had them in the history of the world. But I do think it's possible, and we should never renounce that aim, that through social community, recognizing all our differences in physical strength, in ability to recognize, in productivity, in economic performance, different religions. In spite of recognizing all those differences, the greatest challenge for civilization is to take that power that human beings have and enable it to unfold without one power seeking through force to break another. And there it's important to see, of course, that where there are deviations, where our nature is untamed, we are going to stumble across border areas, boundaries, and the aim there will be to take the self-discipline that we are able to apply, because we are in ourselves contradictory, that we take that discipline and use it in a social context. And if we have no other option other than to force somebody to do something, to leave another person in peace, then we need a political and legal organizational structure which is able to substantiate the use of force in limited, well-defined situations. That is what we talk about when we say that the state, for example, has sovereignty or a monopoly on force. And in developing civilizations, that is the great challenge that humanity has confronted. And certainly since the 17th century, we have understood that. Human rights have been developed as an important factor in that process to provide a basis for legitimating the use of power. But we can see that whether it's for religious reasons or because of other traditional factors, the desire for conflict is still there, and we haven't yet come up with the philosopher's stone or the world structure which can, by and large, let's say, resolve conflicts peacefully. But that needs to be the aim of politics, and political philosophy must, the way I see it, devote itself to that aim. That's why I wrote my theory of politics in the 90s, inspired by Kant's idea of perpetual freedom, that freedom that we must never break by, for example, pretending we want peace when we don't. And of course, I am perplexed that we don't have more recognition of this need, but of course humanity is a project for self-education, and we're not going to be suddenly able to resolve it in 2014. We can assume it's going to take a few more centuries. And philosophy needs to play its part in that. That is really fascinating. You've also written about participation in politics. Why is participation so important? My systematic work, following the historical studies of Kant and Nietzsche, are based on a principle which I believe is the original principle of human action, and that is the principle of self-determination. We have to acknowledge that a human being is a human in the sense that he or she recognizes his or her own will. This relates to ethics, and it goes back to ancient history, even though there wasn't a word for it then. Certainly since Kant and the end of the 18th century, we do have this central term of self-determination. It's a fundamental concept in ethics and the basic principle of individuality. Many understood me to be an egomaniac, to be suggesting a policy based on relentless egocentrism, only self-determination and not the determination of others. You only have to read 3 lines in my book to understand that that is absolutely not what I am seeking to do. Hence the second step, which was to show how self-determination relates to reason and life, and can only develop in individuals through relations, through relationships which evolve out of older traditions, so that individuals, with all they think and want and do, are always borrowing from contexts from which they cannot ever liberate themselves entirely. And the third step was to come on to this concept, participation. And if we look at political theory and political language, I would say it's a concept which is almost self-evident. It's about taking part, participating in social life. I think I showed for the first time that this concept, participation, is the defining term of politics. In Aristotle, we have a description of the citizen, man as a political animal, humanity as a being able to take part in the judicial and political process, being able to take part in the polis, in these common institutions, defines the ability to be political. And if you take that Greek term isotes, in the Latin translation of Aristotle's politics in the 13th century, the term participatio was used. And we have this concept recognized now in all European languages. I simply picked up on that. So in my definition of politics, I was drawing on the Aristotelian definition of politics, and of course Aristotle is a pupil of Plato, and if we look at Plato's last great work, Nomoi, we see how he describes politics, and the best of all possible states, which makes it clear that the shared participation of citizens in the business of the state is the foundation for political activity. And so I use that as a defining concept in our self-conception of political activity. We are aware, we are self-determined in defending the way we take part in this political framework, aware that we do this jointly or in conjunction with others, and that this is a common cause. Let me add that this notion has been of such great importance to me philosophically, because if we translate participatio back into ancient Greek, it is exactly this term methexis that Plato uses in relation to our recognition of ourselves. The fact that we recognize a table, a chair, or whatever is always a methexis. We are sharing in an idea, the idea of the chair or the table. And any description of an individual thing can only be understood because in this individual thing we recognize something universal. In this specific book, I recognize the idea of the book. It's not that I'm a Neoplatonist, but we participate in an idea when we recognize ourselves as individuals. So from that point of view, this concept of participatio is the bridge between theoretical and practical philosophy. Then you absolutely must talk to us about the functions of the consciousness, because I think that that is another step forward, where you say consciousness is essential if we are to make this public effort, and vice versa. Yes, Ms. Mavelia, you're absolutely right. That's exactly the development my thoughts pursued. After participation in 2007, it was when that young research project was underway that you mentioned, set up by the federal German government on the function of consciousness, when I did my in-depth studies on what is public, what makes public discourse. And the central thesis of what is public is that our consciousness itself is public. For many centuries in philosophy, we've had the idea that everyone has their own consciousness for themselves, that we have this kind of brain box with our own, if you like, living room movie. To some extent that's true, because we are able to have our own thoughts and we are able to keep our thoughts to ourselves. But what a thought is, or what a recognition is manifested only in the fact that its significance and function can only exist through communication. So from that point of view, this notion of communicability, as Kant calls it, is the pivotal thought relating to the function of the consciousness. So if you listen, communicability, you have concern and participation that I was describing before. So the sociomorphic function of consciousness, the fact that individual consciousness is embedded in a social form of communication, understanding one another, communication, that is the basic thought underlying my work on public discourse. So in spite of many descriptions that we can read in recent literature, I developed the idea that Public discourse doesn't enter the world with printing or scholarship or industrial bourgeois society, where public discourse plays an important role in politics, we can show that in terms of the concept, the term goes back to the Romans and the ancient Greeks. The Romans talk about res publica. That's how they describe politics. And it's very similar in ancient Greece. Demos, where we get our word democracy from, is a sphere within which people communicate with one another. And we can follow that at least down to the period when law begins to take shape and civilization based on trading. So public discourse is part of that early cultivation of language and the use of law and signs. And this is what makes human beings function within an atmosphere of common action. And I think we can show that consciousness is not simply what makes us clever or slow or unpredictable, that too, of course, but it's something which manifests our common humanity, our character as human animals. And given that that is the case, I hope that this commonality offers a prospect for many people and indeed all humanity to live in peace. And that explains the dissemination of social media, which has happened so quickly. That would explain what has happened. Yes, of course, I took a look at that too, because that is a determining factor in public discussion. I would agree with you on that. The dissemination of the book happened fast enough as it is. After, in the late 15th century, the technical invention occurred, in the early 16th century we were already seeing artistic books and print shops all over Europe. And with the network, the internet, communication through digital media, it's simply been faster. The great appeal of it is that as an individual, self-determined with your own consciousness, you believe that you are linked up to everybody else. That is indisputable. That is the great appeal. And we can't mess about with that. We are familiar with the powerful criticism there has been of the dangers of the social media, and I wouldn't dispute that. If we open these media to all, under the domination of monopolies with not many network operators and service providers and program manufacturers, there is a great danger there, and I think there needs to be an objective there for politics to keep the markets open and to ensure that there is freedom under these conditions to communicate on the web. And then I think we have another opportunity, an additional opportunity for this participating consciousness to be able to guide us in a global cooperative framework. Fantastic! We've heard so many fascinating ideas from you. Now I have a question for our young users, our budding philosophers, budding politicians among them. What advice would you have for our budding philosophers and politicians? If we're talking about people who wish to become philosophers, then I think there is no more important advice than to say, seek your own perceptions, your own recognition, and through that pay close attention to the perceptions of others and seek to substantiate your worldview in that context. Autonomy and one's own thoughtfulness I believe, are the most important tools of the philosopher. And I think that's attractive enough, because we can see with people again and again that they only feel happy if they get their own way, and if they feel that their understanding of things is respected. If you can contribute that to philosophy, that you're not simply obstinate and lost in your own world, but actually recognize the thoughts of others, that's not only much more pleasurable, and I'm talking there from experience in the world of philosophy, but it helps many to gain additional recognitions. And politicians have to act. They have to be vigorous, they have to be energetic, they have to want to move things forward. And for that, they need ideas, they need powers of persuasion. And they can do that productively only if they have their own recognitions underlying their work. That they're not guided by the expectations of the day, but from the outset, from the beginning of their careers, have their own recognition that certain things are important to them. And these things that are important to them, for which they have arguments, can only be implemented in conjunction with others. This expectation that politician needs to be guided by recognition is what is behind Plato's famous call that philosophers should be kings. Of course, nobody assumes that today. We expect our kings to represent us and nothing more than that. Kant reformulated that by saying it would be a poor thing if philosophers had to be kings, because they'd have far too many things to do and would be distracted from their thinking. But they do need the opportunity to take their thoughts into the political framework, into a critical framework, and they need the freedom to do that. You need politicians who are interested. Ultimately, what is really important in life then, Professor Gerhardt? You couldn't have put a harder question to me, could you? It's important to be alive and to live in harmony with oneself. And I believe one can only do that by unfolding one's own aspirations. And I am a long way removed from the idea that there is one ideal in life. We must all live in our own way. We must all find our own purpose in life. And people can be happy under very different conditions. But to be happy, they do need a certain confidence in themselves and a certain confidence in the world, especially under tough conditions. I think that's the most important thing, that we know we can achieve our purpose despite the conditions, because when I look back to what I described before, the conditions in which I began my life, then I am amazed that when I started school, and there are photographs of 1951, that I look so optimistic about the world. How can that be? How was I able to do that? But it is possible. If one has a particular expectation, which is not exaggerated, but as a result of perception and recognition of one's environment, which may contain it or may offer the chance of broadening it, but if you can trust in being able to rely on others, you need also trust in yourself, so that however modest your contribution is, you can contribute. Thank you very much indeed for this interview, Professor Gerhardt. Thank you.